All right, I think we should probably get started. I want to welcome everybody to this week's strategic overview. I'm Susan Kokinda, and tonight we're joined by Mike Stager, who's going to give the overview. I hope people had the opportunity over the Thanksgiving holiday to reflect somewhat on the deeper principles that underlay the fight which we're in. I think it's especially important right now because one of the key tactics that the enemy uses is to constantly bombard you with more insane, more irrational, more criminal actions. And as Michael is going to discuss tonight, this week falling in that category, we have the Omicron variant, we have the neocons saber rattling over Russia, and we have the daily effects of the shutdown of our physical economy on our day-to-day lives, which is why it's always important to pull back from this bombardment and think about the larger war and where we want to go in this war. Now, obviously, an immediate horizon for the American people is the 2022 elections, which are now less than a year away. But what is going to be urgent in that fight is to keep in the forefront of our minds the fundamental principled fight that we are waging with the enemy. It's too easy to get caught up in the slogans, the hot button issues, the mechanics, and for that matter, the resources of running for office. But what is going to determine the outcome, the successful outcome, defined by whether or not we're going to save this country, what is going to determine the outcome is if we have sufficient people organizing, running for office, who are looking more deeply at what the actual fight is. And for us, the fundamental principle manifests itself in the fight between the Anglo-Dutch imperial system and the American system of political economy, as was deepened by Lyndon LaRouche. Now, that's not the terms most people are thinking in. That's certainly not the terms the talking heads are talking in. And that could prove fatal, because many of the patriots running for office, who in their hearts and souls are passionate patriots, are infected with British philosophical liberalism. Now, if you said to any of them that they were infected with liberalism, they'd probably punch you in the nose. But when you dig a little bit deeper, what you find is that the policies of Friedrich von Hayek, of Hillsdale College's pushing of the Austrian school, is British philosophical liberalism, and it's just as dangerous, and maybe even more dangerous because people are less conscious of it, of the better known left-wing variety of British liberalism. Now, I want to point to a series on our website. I'm going to share the screen here, which addresses this question in a very, very powerful way. This is the fifth in a series of articles that have been written by Bob Ingram entitled, "It's Time to Learn Real American Economics." The first several installments of this went after the question of Hillsdale College, went after Friedrich von Hayek. Now, this wasn't just an expose, although Bob certainly exposes some pretty explosive things, like the fact that von Hayek doesn't like national sovereignty and prefers world federalism, or the fact that he and John Maynard Keynes were very admiring of each other, with frankly fairly minor differences in the implementation of the same imperial policies. But what is very powerful about this series, and it's not finished yet, I think he's got 2 more installments, is that he does take this on from the standpoint of principle. What is the principal difference in terms of the image of man, in terms of how you organize your society, in terms of how you organize your economy? What is the difference between an empire and a sovereign republic? And it is absolutely urgent that everybody who is fighting for the future of this nation dive into this series that Bob is unfolding before us. You may disagree with parts of it may make you upset. That's good. That's the process of dialogue that we actually need to have, because this question of what is the principled basis of economic policy is going to be what determines whether or not we are successful over the course of the next year and over the course of the coming years. So I think Mike is going to take on this question of principle from a standpoint that perhaps you're not expecting. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks a lot, Susan. All right, so let me just say thanks to those who are running for office or are thinking about running for office. It is a critical part of what I would call building a patriotic army. You need people to take that responsibility, and it's from school boards, city councils, state reps, county commissioners, to federal offices. Because we need people who are willing to take a responsibility to get this nation functioning again. And for those of you thinking about it, we would encourage you to definitely read Bob Ingram's series of articles, Mike Carr's series of articles. Brian Lance is going to begin this Saturday an economic discussion on LaRouche's discovery and other elements, which will be at least the next 3 Saturdays. So hopefully to give some broader framework, but we're here to give, I believe, and this is what I think Mr. LaRouche did incredibly well. He did it for me personally. I think he did it for many of us on this call, was to broaden the scope of what is the battlefield of this war. As one British psychologist once, called it the battle for the mind. It really is, not necessarily in a good way, how he meant it, but it really is a much bigger cultural dynamic of how we're able to think about our society, our civilization, our nation. And that's what I want to take up tonight. But let's just cover a few things that have been developing over the course of even today. I mean, people have seen the Omicron virus, so-called Omicron, whatever. I mean, everything is a new variant, how we determine this, how they, and largely we can see it's, I think someone posted, there's a various meme going around, you loosen up a little bit, things kind of get back to normal, a new variant, new lockdowns, new mandates, new boosters, things open up a little bit, new variant, and you're kind of caught in this horrible version of Groundhog Day. That is this ever going to end? And it's you start to see there's even a kind of an existential anxiety. Is this ever going to end? Are they going to come up with new reasons to mask our children, push vaccinations, push mandates? Now, I can say that there's a number of things besides the pushback on OSHA, on the OSHA mandate, which would force every company with 100 or more employees to mandate the vaccines with very strict, if non-existent, exemptions. There's major pushback. You can respond on the OSHA website to give your feedback. I would say that when LaRouche PAC and Mr. LaRouche personally said in 2009, under the behaviorist program of Obama, and their Obamacare policies, that as Dr. Leo Alexander said, the coercion for medical experimentation, which is what mandates for education, for college, for your work. And remember, for many people, their jobs are their health insurance plans, largely at larger corporations, which then allow another person to work somewhere else, maybe in the family. But that kind of coercion is what Dr. Leo Alexander in the New England Journal of Medicine identified. I think might be 48 or early 50s. But he documents very clearly, he calls it Hegelian utilitarianism, that beginning led to then the depriving of care, which they're already beginning to say, if you're unvaccinated, should you be cared for? They're at least raising the ethical question, which is a budgetary question or an ideological question, that this is ultimately what led to the ability to do the death camps and the Holocaust, which was not just Jews, but it was a broad range of cheap labor policies. And then when you could no longer, after a low-calorie diet, work 18 hours a day, you'd be gassed and incinerated. That's the economic policy that Lyndon LaRouche identified 50 years ago. And they're now bringing it to bear not simply as a, a freedom to choose. They're now mandating this kind of program. Now, the good thing is, and you can comment on OSHA, we should push back on that. There was a federal ruling in Missouri today that pushed back the, I think it's CMI, but it's the Medicare and Medicaid people. So a lot of the long-term care facility workers who are going to be mandated if they worked with Medicare and Medicaid patients are not going to be mandated in those 10 states. Hopefully that can get applied nationally. Alex Berenson, who's been covering this COVID cult phenomena throughout the last year and a half very effectively, is reporting that a lot of companies have gotten such pushback they'd rather just silently go away. And the big mask on Fauci was taken off, and they found out that he has a little tiny mask right here under his nose. They're calling it Fauciism or Faucism. So, again, I guess Fauci today said he is the science. Criticisms of him are criticisms of science. The Babylon Bee had a good response. Hitler said, challenging my policies is challenging the science of things like eugenics. I mean, the parallels are so obvious that what LaRouche-Pack was in an uncharted way, no one else had the guts to come out and say what we said about that program in 2009. And many people today, I talked to some people today, realized, my God, I had no idea what Obamacare really was. Now you're seeing it. Now you see what the death panels look like. Who gets treated? Who doesn't? Do you want to see your loved ones when they're dying? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. We control all of this. And as Leo Alexander documented then, so where this goes. So there's pushback, there's resistance, but it has to be increased. And that's partly why we need more people running for office. You've also got the, we posted on the website, the ongoing push for a British-sponsored neocon adventure into Ukraine, and the ongoing push for a confrontation with Russia, a confrontation with China, is constantly being pushed by these factors. And people should look at the coverage. We, again, LaRouche-Pack covered this in 2013, the coup in Ukraine under Obama, with Joe Biden as the local viceroy, ran a Nazi-led coup in Ukraine. And literally, even the New York Times has had to admit that neo-Nazis were a rampant and military faction of this coup process. Not even neo-Nazis, just Nazis. I mean, literally connected to the same pedigree. So the sense that this is fascism, the sense that this is a political shifting point is hard to miss. As I said in the email we sent out today, the question that, and the challenge I think we face is, sorry, nose is itching here. The challenge that we face is that this is not a war that started 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago with Obama, or even at 9/11. You could even say it's really about 75, 76 years. You could even really extend it further. People look at the history of things. You look at where did this FBI come from? Oh, I forgot to mention, Chris Rufo just reported there was a school board north of Austin, Texas, that deployed police officers to arrest two parents who in the meeting earlier in the week didn't follow the school board meeting's rules or orders from the school board. They had the parents arrested and thrown in prison. The wives then organized a vigil outside all night until the men were eventually released. One was a pastor, the other one was a former captain in the U.S. Army. I mean, the school boards have police forces. You know, it is I would call it a tyranny of the twerps, these ridiculously weak, incompetent, ideological, overly educated bureaucrats or twerps who think that they can now run roughshod over the Constitution, over the American people, literally to the point of arresting parents out of their home, criminalizing them. This is the FBI, this is the DOJ, this is what we saw exploited by this regime with the school boards in Loudoun County and so on. But this didn't just start recently. Um, the It's a deeper war. And the reason why that's worth pointing out, and I would say, LaRouche Pax and Mr. LaRouche's, I think, unique role in this was to say, look, this is a war. Most wars do not involve, or if they do involve direct conflict, armed conflict, it's a small percentage of the conflict. The broader conflict happening for years, even decades prior to that potentially armed conflict is entirely a cultural process. And one of the ways the enemy works is to convince you you shouldn't be fighting. You should just work with the enemy. That there really isn't a war. And that's been a propaganda machine for quite some time. It's this propaganda machine that tried to label Lyndon LaRouche and our organization, political extremists. That was, constantly said over and over again in the media. But I want to give an example of why this question of broader strategy or grand strategy of warfare, cultural warfare, is so important. Now, this is something that was, this approach that I'm about to develop was consistent with our founding fathers. That we went back to a historical study. How did the attempted establishments of different governments function? And how did those governments, how did those civilizations not survive? Because many didn't. Most didn't. Like most species, most societies and civilizations don't have the fitness to survive. And of course, a clear study at that time coming out of the Renaissance was classical Greece, ancient Greece. And so I went back, and there's, all of us are looking at history now because of the way that this stage of politics is unfolded. And I went back and looked at Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. I'm about 5 years into what is a 20-year, or at least what Thucydides covers, about 20 years of an extended, protracted civil war in Greece, largely between Athens and Sparta, as many people know. But within the first 5 years, what you're struck by is a question, at least what I was struck by was a question: why didn't Athens, why did they concede the land fight to Sparta? So Pericles, who was considered the great leader, but really he may have been better than those who came after him, but that doesn't say much. He made a decision that they were going to lock themselves in the walls of Athens, which eventually led to massive plagues that killed Pericles himself, but lock themselves in and use their dominant navy to wage a protracted war. Now, if anyone studies the efforts of MacArthur in the Pacific, whether World War II or in Korea, he was very well aware that that leads to just massive destruction of the population and of your own army. You have to find a way to flank the enemy. So there was a figure from Athens who was in high repute and then lost it and then regained it, named Demosthenes. And he decided that he was going to land in Spartan territory, and he was going to kind of take a certain port area in the southwest part of the Peloponnese, the land area beneath the isthmus. And he effectively does it. It's in a cove with an island just off the coast. So it's a very protected cove. So he secures it, he fortifies it, and then he arms the fortification. And of course, because of the psychological question that Sparta should be able to dominate its own territory, it can dominate any territory on land. The Spartans freak out. They have to get rid of this. This is the thorn in their side. They can't accept this. And so they mobilize both land and their naval forces. But out of their desperation, they make great blunders. Demosthenes organizes the naval fleet from Athens to come in and support the fortification. They come in at the appropriate time. The Spartans make major mistakes, and they basically lose their entire fleet. They can't break the fortification. It was a good place to make a fortification. And the Spartans, after 5 years, are basically now in a position they're going to concede. Because the whole question the whole time was, why are the Athenians just giving the Spartans their territory? Why are they conceding that? It's a war. find a way to change the entire dynamic. Because everybody in all of the Greek world, if the Spartans lose on their own territory, my God, there's no way we can count on them to defend us. So Demosthenes effectively intervenes. The Spartans send an envoy to Athens to basically say, let's end the war. Now, they do it in a very proud way, like, you should end the war now because this is good for you. We're having to come here. Thucydides paints the picture that the Spartans were very boastful and too proud. And that played directly into the increased degeneracy of Athens. So the leader, Cleon of Athens, a popular leader, basically convinces them to basically have to negotiate. The Spartans are even willing to concede. Okay, fine, you want a lot from us. Give us a few people and we'll negotiate in private so we don't have to basically embarrass ourselves, you could say. And Cleon says, no, if you're going to discuss with us, you're going to do it in public with everyone. And the Spartans are like, well, screw you. We can't do that. We can't basically make the Spartans look like a bunch of weak cowards. And so we're going to leave. And the war goes on for decades. And it largely destroys Greek civilization. Now, if this was a play, a Shakespearean play, you could say that Cleon was the tragic figure. But that would be wrong. What failed was that within the Athenian culture, and this comes later, and Susan may have something to say on this, what comes after this tragic wars is Plato's recognition that something was fundamentally missing. Something was fundamentally missing in the Athenian culture. A sense, and as I would put it, what eventually develops within the minds of the great thinkers of the Renaissance, people like Nicholas of Cusa, who developed the idea of the Commonwealth. And if you go to Bob Ingram's recent part 6, he lays, or I think it's actually part 5, in opposition to the Anglo-Dutch system, that this British liberal model we have today was a direct response to the discovery made at the time of the Renaissance towards what was lacking in the Greek world. That the idea that, yes, you would accept the Spartans' desire for ending the war, but you would say we're going to create a new civilization, a new society, based on something that all Greeks are going to join together. They just faced the Persian Wars where they were all under assault, and many Greek tribes sided with the Persians out of weakness and fear, whereas the Athenians and Spartans did not. But to actually put forth a higher hypothesis, a higher conception of unifying the people towards a common and shared mission. That was lacking. It was a tragic cultural circumstance. So even within that tragedy, there was a sense by Demosthenes and others, who at least would be willing to support him, to make a unique and creative intervention, a flank onto the Spartans. Yet there was not the cultural scope to say, how are we going to secure, if we can get our enemy to concede, if we can break them, what are we going to replace the current failed system with? Now, what's provocative is when you look back at American culture and history, one has to wonder, what was the conception George Washington had? Remember, it's famous, if you read Washington Irving's famous biography of George Washington, it's like 3 parts, it's a huge volume, and George Washington had said, anyone who writes a biography of me must include the full scope of the war. And so Washington Irving, his namesake, then does that. And it's extraordinary. And one thing that always stands out in my mind was something you don't hear, right? You think of Washington kind of elegantly coming to Boston during the siege, having the cannons on top of the Roxbury Hills, bombarding British ships out of the Boston Harbor, and then eventually coming to lead the army in places like crossing the Delaware and so on. But what Washington Irving describes is that George Washington, once he was prepared to join the fight, probably in early 75, he was prepared to wage a conflict directly with the British. And if that were to be unsuccessful, meaning an actual regimented army against the British as was fought, if that were to fail, Washington was willing to go into the hills of West Virginia, the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Appalachians, and fight a guerrilla warfare to basically rid the country of this Tory British disease. And what that suggests is that Washington had a conception. What was he defending? He wasn't just defending the state of Virginia. There was no really, the Articles of Confederation were incredibly weak. Some states had never even joined them until the war was practically won. What was the idea that Washington had in his mind? And what I raised that for is because there were no constitutional documents, there was nothing clear or fortified, that the nation is something of a higher concept than even the documents that define it provide. And from that concept come the ongoing breakthroughs and advancements we make in this more perfect union, in creating that more perfect union. And this gets us to how we might think then of grand strategy. And if those who know Mr. LaRouche's writings are provoked by some of the mathematical references, in some ways, Riemann's work in abelian functions points to this. And that's just kind of a fun aside. But what I want to use to demonstrate, and Bob Ingram's latest piece, part 6, touches on this, is what Lyndon LaRouche writes about the 4 laws. Now, Alexander Hamilton was fighting the wars alongside Washington, literally, and then broke off and fought, digging the trenches at Yorktown. And after the war was won, Hamilton, more than anyone, maybe any other founding father, was able to clarify by specific points, specific singularities of what we have to accomplish if we are going to secure not just the military victory, but the broader cultural victory of the war. That we can make definitive the most important concepts of this idea of a nation that will fortify and allow that nation to thrive and grow. And you have to pick your battles. You have to know the specific singular points that are key, that if you can dominate and control that so-called kind of broader cultural territory, you can advance and win over generations. And if you lose those, then you could be destroyed. And that's what's happened. They've just taken those key critical points that Hamilton identified, that Lincoln identified, that Mr. LaRouche identified, and they have been able to wage a relentless war, destroying our cities, our people, our manufacturing, our industry. To say we went through a period of deindustrialization, it means that we were being aggressively destroyed by an enemy against our country. They were devastating our people, psychologically breaking them, destroying the family foundations to develop a new generation. And now they're brainwashing some of the most affluent. Loudoun County, where this education fight has center stage, is the most affluent county in the country. This isn't happening just in the poor, destroyed urban centers, now deindustrialized. It's happening in the most affluent suburbs of the country. And ironically, where you actually have some of the greatest patriotic ferment is happening from these shell of former towns and cities. These industrial areas in the heartland or flyover parts of the country. What Hamilton identified, just to lay out very quickly, is you better have a clear sense of control over your credit and currency. If you shop out your currency and credit to a private institution, you will be easily destroyed. You have to build up a manufacturing and industrial base. It's of critical consequence. You have to secure not just the bank, and besides the currency and credit, secure a banking system that can provide that credit to be distributed to the most productive and creative members of your society. Like a viable local commercial banking system that takes the most industrious farmers, manufacturers, entrepreneurs, merchants, tradesmen, and builds that dynamic up. And you shut down the speculative activity, the cheap labor activity. And so when we discuss these questions of, say, economics, which has been distorted into a horribly bad word of, people babbling like they're on some kind of psychotropic drug, like Alan Greenspan or something. What we're talking about is a national strategy for victory for our nation and for our civilization. And that there are key singularities. It were these singularities that Lyndon LaRouche identified. And in doing so, he added a critical component, that we have a science driver component. You take the most advanced questions, most advanced challenges, like space exploration and fusion energy. But this is not simply a kind of, can we develop a society versus Hayek or Keynes or Adam Smith. It's not a theoretical discussion. It's warfare. It's existential warfare. These other theories aren't just possible theories. The effects they've had on our country to destroy it were intended. What you see with this kind of cultural fascism is to brainwash people to be so overly educated based on ideologies that they lose touch with real human beings and reality. And so this is the kind of challenge that we're faced with. There's what we haven't touched on, and maybe we don't have time. Well, maybe we have time tonight in the questions, but I'm not going to touch on it much now, is even the deeper cultural fights. Someone like Mozart, a brilliant genius, was not unaware of this warfare. He saw it personally. He was probably even killed, assassinated because of it. Mozart recognized this cultural warfare was of a similar characteristic. That there's something about the human mind that Hamilton recognized. He called it the powers of genius, the American quality of genius. Lincoln clearly saw this quality of genius, of discovery, of inventions. That's what led to people like Alexander Graham Bell, Westinghouse, Edison, the Wright brothers, that whole flourishing period of the 19th century that Mike Carr has covered. And it's a question of how do we, as a now a patriotic army, bring this to bear? Not simply defending the Bill of Rights and Constitution. That's a must. But it's not simply defending a tradition. It's recognizing that it's a broader concept, a higher principle. One given to us made accessible by our Creator. But it's a higher governing principle. What was lacking in Athens, what our founding fathers were able to identify, and is incumbent upon us today if we're going to win the war. Because I think it's undeniable, war has been declared. And it's not simply, as Bill de Blasio said, he said New York had these vaccines, and they'll say, well, we'll let people choose. You want to choose a vaccine, take a vaccine, it's good for you. Then they offered some French fries. Hey, get a free burger and fries. And he's this horribly disgusting advertisement of him eating French fries and saying, so good. How could you not want to get a vaccine for these fries? I mean, they're even offering, in Europe, apparently, you can get a free shot at the brothel if you get a vaccine. I mean, this is really degenerate, perverse stuff. But he says, if you don't choose we gave people the choice, and they just didn't choose with all those great incentives. They didn't choose the right answer. Now we have to mandate it. You're facing a shift from a fascist policy of destruction of our nation, a deindustrialization, and a cultural wrecking, to now a totalitarian mandating of it, a mandating of shutting down power supply while we build solar panels and windmills, which will be totally ineffective. And so it's a question of, and I think from this standpoint, we start to gain a sense that this is a national emergency. We need a functioning federal government to come in with a strong hand. How long they can keep printing this money before the system wreaks havoc, it's very hard to know. I don't think anyone can forecast that. Certainly predictions are worth, the money they're printed on. But we need a strong federal government to address a growing economic crisis from the standpoint of a sense of cultural warfare. We are going to build up the creative powers of our society. And we're going to unify our people, and then we're going to unify nations in that regard against these globalist and corporatist entities. And if that's the mission, if that's clear, then I think we can all be certain we're going to win this war. I think Trump recognizes that. He declared death to the old GOP. But he's going to need an effective, any president, whether it's Trump or those that come after him, are going to need an effective army who are mobilized from this perspective. And we're hoping that's you. We're hoping you can help us grow this. And I would just say as marching orders, and we'll maybe come to this at the end, get to events, go find out candidates that are running, challenge them, see where you stand amongst them, organize them. If there's qualified people, help mobilize for them. Bring them onto these calls. Bring back your discussions with them and others. But let's get out there. This nation is alive with political fight. But the broader strategic questions of how we win this war are things that have to be discussed. We have to raise the cultural standard. So I think that's the mission. And I guess we'll take some questions and see what people think.